Que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to episode 30, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. And today we're talking about Chile, neoliberalism, and state violence. And joining us to discuss this and more is Comrade Chris Durán. I've followed and known about Chris for many years, so it's a pleasure to be able to speak with him finally today. He's, those people on social media on Facebook that every time they share something, you almost agree with everything they post. And everything that Chris posts, I'm like, damn, he has some really great articles, really posts some amazing content on Facebook. And I just wanted to point that out before I introduce him. But Chris is a student and community organizer working with Free 'em All, New Jersey. He also works with several other campaigns to free U.S.-held political prisoners and prisoners of war. Chris is a first-year graduate student at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. Shout out to NYU. I also went to NYU back in the day. I'm from New York, but I live in LA. And Chris also has roots from Chile. How's it going, Chris? Hold on, let me. Okay, perfect. I hear you. But yeah, man, it's great to be able to speak with you. We've been following each other for several years now, and a lot of the content that you post is dope. I like the stuff you share because you post stuff that links the national oppression in the U.S., police violence, terrorism, poverty, with stuff going on around the world. You have a very internationalist perspective, which I definitely enjoy, because a lot of times it's one or the other, and it's always refreshing to have somebody that is involved in both stuff. So before we get into talking about the anniversary of Chile and neoliberalism and state violence, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your organization and the work that you do?
So Free 'em All was founded this past year to try and elevate the political prisoner struggle, particularly in North Jersey, which is where we're all located. I don't know really what to add to that.
That's all good. What part of Jersey are you in?
I'm in Maplewood, so it's a little suburb right outside of Newark, and other people that we've been working with are mostly in the Newark area, Patterson, Jersey City, New Brunswick area, so. And, we've been trying to basically connect with youth organizations up here and also in New York and Philadelphia and, across the country where, folks are also getting involved and trying to elevate the political prisoner struggle, and also connecting, the struggle that elders have passed on to us. So.
Most definitely. And it's cool because New Jersey has a long history of revolutionary organizing. I mean, Asada, our grandmother of the revolutionary movement, the Panthers, BLA, and the Cuban Revolution, one of my favorite Marxist-Leninists comes from Jersey, was prosecuted and attacked in Jersey. I know the Panthers had a big chapter out there back in the day, the Young Lords, so many groups that were based in Jersey. So it's cool to be able to hear that struggle still continue. Russell Maroon Schultz, I think some of his family is involved in organizing out there. Shout out to Comrade Erica. Comrade Erica said, shout out to Freedom Mall, New Jersey, Curb Fest for political prisoners tomorrow in Philly. Make sure to go to that for those of you on the East Coast. And also shout out to Howard, to Obnoxious Anarchist, Colorful Outcast. They said, watching from Chile, saludos camaradas, saludos. International conversation. So me and Chris were talking the other day, and recently was the anniversary of September 11th. There was, obviously, we know about the situation with the US, 9/11, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center. But there was also September 11th, 1973, the coup against Salvador Allende, the first Marxist president of Chile, a revolutionary, one of my favorite communists from Latin America and the Caribbean, who came to power at a time when it was extremely, it still is extremely dangerous to be a communist in Latin America. But even in the 70s, at that time, at the height of the Cold War, it was extremely dangerous for somebody to come out as a Marxist and carry out all of the progressive reforms that he did in Chile. So he was overthrown, brutally murdered in 1973, September 11th. And we like to commemorate that anniversary because it's one that is not very often talked about. Most people in the US, unfortunately, don't even know who Salvador Allende is, let alone that he was brutally murdered and that so many horrific acts were committed after that day, after September 11th, 1973. Before talking about neoliberalism, because that's something that I want to get into with you today, Chris, because a lot of people on the right, a lot of the free market, pro-capitalist people, they say that getting rid of Allende was a good thing, that Pinochet came in, that he improved the economy, and some people even describe Chile as a, quote, economic miracle. And to me, it's just completely disgusting, the irony, because so much poverty and violence that was imposed on Chile under Pinochet that happened. But maybe you can share with us your thoughts about the recent anniversary of the September 11th coup in Chile and where Chile is today.
Yeah, so it's honestly interesting because growing up in the United States, I had always known, just based off of stuff my family told me, that this happened back in 1973, and so it was always kind of common knowledge to me. But it was always very interesting that every year, on September 11th, there's always this huge commemoration of the attack on the Twin Towers, and but I never heard anything about Chile in school, anything like that. So yeah, as you said, on September 11th, 1973, the United States backed a military coup that imposed openly a fascist regime in Chile, and with it, economic advisors from the United States that imposed what they call the shock doctrine of neoliberal, was now called neoliberal economics, is very similar to what was then imposed in the United States in terms of cutting all public benefits or privatizing all public benefits. And in the case of a place like Chile, where there's a huge export of natural resources, privatizing all natural resources and putting an end to any kind of progressive movement there. So calling it an economic miracle, it is very similar to the way that the United States portrays the narrative around Latin American countries or global South countries generally. When it comes to economics, you see the same kind of narrative about Venezuela, in its neoliberal time. We say, oh, they had the most successful economy. And then after Chavez came in, everything got ruined. But, what's not talked about is the fact that, there's these huge revenues based off of exports and the privatization of resources for a very small elite, comprador elite in the country, while the masses of people basically go hungry. And so you have, this huge like financial sector now in Chile, but that's only in a very concentrated downtown area of like Santiago, which is the capital. And the rest of that city and the rest of the country does not look like an economic miracle. People still live with without access to very basic resources. Water is privatized, everything, and so there's no access to healthcare, water. Education is very is also very limited. And this kind of condition is very similar to the rest of Latin America. It's just that the narrative around it is basically shaped to say that capitalism works, and the appearance of democracy, the appearance of like normalcy, is what matters, and that anything that tries to move things away from that and nationalizes resources are that's a drain on the economy, and that's evil. But you see when that happens, like Allende did, and like Chavez, sought to do. The United States immediately places sanctions on those countries anytime they try to reclaim natural resources and try to reclaim any kind of ownership over, labor and all the other kind of resources that they have in that country. So to call it an economic miracle is really that's pretty much been completely exposed within the last year, where anybody following Chile has noticed that the country basically erupted in like mass rebellion, against the government and against the neoliberal order there. So even during Pinochet's time, there were regular kind of like rebellious movements against that dictatorship. And then following, in this period of so-called democracy, there were still, large-scale protests periodically. But this is the first time that there's been like this sustained protest for months. People out in the streets in like thousands across cities throughout the country. In a pandemic, and it didn't it never stopped, and it forced now this process of constitutional reform. Where basically they're trying to reform or change the constitution from what it was. So Pinochet drafted his own constitution in the 80s, and they adopted that, and it's been the same since then. And so it doesn't even allow for certain reforms that would make a lot of resources more accessible to the people. And so they're seeking to reform that now, and that's entirely due to this like mass rebellion. So the myth of like neoliberalism has been completely shattered. But of course, a lot of economists who get their funding from the United States will not acknowledge that. They'll still prescribe the same things for Chile and for it's fine if you listen to like the commentary on Chile. Within the past year, there's a huge difference between folks who were in the academic world, and particularly the Western left or Western academic world, and folks who are actually in Chile. Folks who are in the academic world, a lot of them say, "Oh, nothing's going to fundamentally change." It would be impractical for them to, change the Constitution and all these sorts of things. But typically these people tend to not really see what's actually going on. So
most definitely, and I'm glad you mentioned the myth of neoliberalism and the free market in Chile, because I think another myth that is very commonly held by a lot of people is that Chile is all the same, that all the people are wealthy white people. Even among a lot of Latinos that I've met who believe that everyone in Chile and Argentina and the Southern Cone are just rich white people who drink wine and have these fancy estates. And it's not the case for the majority of the population. That's what's portrayed in mainstream media. But the majority of the population of Chile, like Argentina as well, are indigenous peoples outside of Santiago, outside of Valparaiso, the capitalist cities that bring in all of the exploited labor and capital from abroad and domestically. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That's why it's important to support the constitutional reform in Chile, because Chile is a multinational nation, just like any other country, just like the United States that has oppressed nationalities, indigenous people, Afro-descendant people. Chile also has oppressed nationalities within the country that have no representation. And this is something that a lot of people don't really understand, that Chile is multinational. And it's important to support the national liberation movements within, especially the Mapuche community that has been repressed by the state. So before getting into talking about Chile in particular, I think it's important to give an overview of what neoliberalism is and how it applies to Chile, because we hear the term neoliberal being used a lot, and we hear neoliberalism very frequently in media, and a lot of us aren't really sure what it is. I myself am still grappling to fully understand what neoliberalism is, but I just want to give everybody an overview based on my understanding of what it is and how to combat it. So within economics, there are four general schools of thought. There obviously are more, but these are the general sketches of economics that are prevalent in the West. We have classical liberalism that was inspired by economists like John Locke and Adam Smith and Ricardo, The Wealth of Nations. This is the original capitalism that came about in the 1700s, 1800s. The Wealth of Nations was actually published 1776, same year as the United States. And this is what is defined as classical liberalism, the free market, individual rights, all of that. And this is different from neoliberalism, neo meaning new liberalism, in the sense that neoliberalism promotes more of a state role, but the state doesn't interfere in the market or what it defines as the free market, but the state is used as a way to impose the free market. So a great example is Chile, and I think that's why we're having this discussion now, because Chile was the breeding ground, was the scientific lab for neoliberalism, where they used the state forcefully in a dictatorship to impose the free market the way that Pinochet did. Because classical liberals like Locke, Adam Smith, Ricardo, even though we know what they were saying was complete bullshit, they were slave owners, they supported some of the most horrendous acts of colonialism, they still at least pretended to promote liberty and individualism. And that's where we get a lot of the libertarians, right, who believe in minimal state intervention, both in the political and in the economic. Neoliberal economics is more focused on the quote unquote free market, the invisible hand, but they believe in using the state forcefully to impose that. So it's even more vicious, I would say. Then the other two schools of thought within economics are Keynesianism, inspired by John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist. And Keynesianism is also capitalist. Let's not get it twisted. Keynes was in favor of capitalism, but he was more on what in the United States, what we would call liberal or democratic, where he wanted a kinder and gentler face of capitalism. He wanted more state presence, right? I think somebody who exemplifies Keynesianism is FDR in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who wanted to maintain capitalism. He didn't want to give the means of production, the wealth of society, back to the workers and the peasants. He wanted to keep it in the hands of the capitalists, but he wanted to have social programs that maintained the people from rebelling. And Keynesian economics has become very popular in Western Europe, especially in a lot of the social imperialist countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, that I still consider to be imperialist, that are still capitalist, but have more social programs, right? They'll have things like universal healthcare, they'll have education, free education and stuff like that, but only for their domestic population. Meanwhile, they're still invested in war, banking, and all of these things that are within the imperialist order. And lastly, of course, we have Marxism, socialism, which believes that the means of production, the wealth of society, the factories, the roads, technology, everything that is produced by humans and workers should be owned. The wealth of society should be owned and managed by those who produce it. And this is called socialism. This is the economic system that we promote. And that eventually transforms into communism over a period of time through the construction of socialism, through nationalizing industry, through uplifting workers. And in Chile in 1970s, you had a battle between both of these forces. Obviously, Salvador Allende was a Marxist. He was ushering in socialism with the Unidad Popular coalition from 1970 to 1973. So he was president for just 3 short years, very short period of time. In those short 3 years, he accomplished many great things. His Unidad Popular in general, the Popular Unity Coalition, we're talking about 12% industrial growth in the country. So unleashing the capabilities and development of Chile, 8.6% increase in GDP, gross domestic product, a major decline in Chile's chronic inflation. He brought inflation down from 34.9% to 22.1%. Inflation being that the cost of goods, the cost of buying things in everyday life, milk, food, gas, inflation is when the prices of commodities go up. So the value of a currency goes down, basically. He brought inflation down. So that helped the working class people of Chile. Unemployment, he brought it down to 3.8%. US right now, as it stands, has a higher unemployment rate than Chile did under Allende. So socialism was employing people, giving government jobs to the masses. Nationalization of copper, which is one of Chile's biggest commodities, one of its most valuable industries that helped lift millions of people out of poverty. Universal healthcare, land redistribution, food programs for the poor, and wage and salary increases for the most oppressed in Chile. So within these 3 short years, very short period of time, right? He was able to implement all of these things using the Marxist economic model of socialism, of bringing the power back to the people. Now, contrast this with Pinochet's dictatorship, which lasted from 1973 to 1990, long period of time. And again, as Chris mentioned, Pinochet came to power in a U.S. coup. Thousands and thousands of people killed in Chile, mainly working class people, activists, indigenous people, brutally tortured, man. I don't even want to go into how crazy that time period was, especially 1973. But you have people like Víctor Jara, who's one of Chile's most amazing musicians, one of my favorite musicians, who had his fingers cut off and tortured in a stadium. You had Pablo Neruda killed. You had so many countless people who were killed during this time. Also, the rise of revolutionary socialist movements in Chile, but so many of them were repressed. So from 1973 to 1990, right-wing neoliberal dictatorship, right? You have immediately everything rolled back, all of the progressive gains made under Allende, everything was privatized, everything was taken back to the corporations who had been kicked out. And check this out, under Pinochet, wages decreased by 8%, family allowances in 1990 and 1989 were 28% of what they had been in 1970. So that's a huge drop, right? Almost by the end of Pinochet's dictatorship in 1989, the family allowances were 20% of what they had been in 1970. Budgets for education, health, and housing had dropped by over 20%. You had these huge international banksters, I like to call them, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, that got the country into millions and millions of dollars into debt, controlling them. Because when you get a country into debt, you're able to control their future. And as a result, you have privatization, schools, education, housing, hospitals that were privatized, no longer accessible by the majority of the people, only a small, wealthy elite. And you have multinational corporations like International Telephone and Telegraph, Dow Chemical and Firestone, and all of these copper extracting companies coming in to privatize the economy. So all of the wealth and resources of Chile is a very wealthy country in terms of natural resources. It has the ability to feed and clothe everybody with the resources there. All of that was taken, extracted, sent to the imperial core countries as part of this imperialist process. And by the end of Pinochet's reign, about 44% of Chilean families were living below the poverty line. So long story short, neoliberalism completely devastated Chile, impoverished the masses, privatized the economy, allowed the first world imperial core companies and corporations to not only get the Chilean people into debt, to force them into debt, but also to extract their resources in a very parasitic way. So this just shows the evil, parasitic nature of neoliberalism, of imperialism, of capitalism that builds its wealth from the exploitation of people in the global south. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything to add related to neoliberalism in Chile and what it's like, and maybe even you can even talk about how neoliberalism also impacts the United States and poor workers and oppressed people here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you covered a lot. So, but yeah, I think one of the first things that like I take note of when you were talking about the different forms of economics was, you know, how Keynesianism, I'm sorry, but how that, you know, manifests itself in the West, but also how that was also based off of the drain of resources in the global South. You know, as Kwame Nkrumah wrote about in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, he talks about how, you know, the Western left and Western workers were separated from any kind of like anti-colonial struggles happening in, you know, the global South due to the, you know, welfare reforms, you know, happening in Western Europe. And, you know, that's also why George Jackson calls FDR a fascist, because of the fact that the New Deal essentially was insurance for empire. And I think that, you know, people need to take careful note of that when advocating for reforms that are similar to, you know, the Bernie Sanders AOC type reforms of like free healthcare and these sorts of things within the United States, because, you know, as you said, you know, neoliberalism and that sort of or here is kind of termed like Reaganomics, and, you know, sort of you know, forced privatization and union busting and all that sort of stuff that took place from the 70s on. You know, although that happened here and it was a drain on the working class in the United States, you know, it also happened in the global South. And, you know, it's not like what came before was also, you know, not affecting the global South. You know, so to redistribute stolen wealth would be a little hypocritical in terms of, at least for those who say they're on the left here in the United States. But yeah, you know, like you said, neoliberalism was imposed not through any kind of like means of liberty and democracy in Latin America. It was imposed through like things like Operation Condor. It was imposed through concentration camps, through mass, you know, persecution of anyone that was deemed like left or communist. You know, basically the suppression of, you know, any type of communist or radical thought that honestly continues to this day. And like you see, you know, like even in the case of Brazil, like, you know, you see indigenous communities being trampled upon. You see, you know, progressives like Lula being, you know, thrown in jail, you know, or you know, Dilma Rousseff, you know, being kicked out of office by the right. In Chile today, you know, the United States still, you know, Biden sold millions of dollars of weapons within his first few weeks in office to Chile. And those weapons are still being used against, you know, the indigenous communities there. You know, one of the major reforms made under Allende was, you know, the expropriation of large land estates. And so there was land reform happening in Chile that, you know, for the indigenous people, it was, you know, giving land, you know, ancestral land back to the people in, you know, predominantly indigenous regions, such as the south of Chile, which, you know, is known as Walmapu, to the people there. And, you know, that was all put to an end under Pinochet. Like he immediately all his lands were taken back by the state and then sold off to private companies. You know, largely multinationals based in the United States or Europe. And, you know, so it's like this reimposition of colonial order in Latin America. And that, you know, that's basically what neoliberalism has served to be in Latin America and also within the United States. I mean, you see, you know, that same type of economics, you know, it related to people here in the United States that were part of the white working class, and that sort of fascist class collaboration that you see here in the United States, among white people. You see that with Reagan. White people love Ronald Reagan. White people love George Bush. They love they love Donald Trump. Doesn't matter what class they're in. That's the history of the white left in the United States, unfortunately, is the history of class traders. And like Robin D.G. Kelly speaks a lot on that. He speaks on how there in the United States you have like these internationalist movements, anti-imperialist working class movements in the United States, happening at the same time as internationalist anti-imperialist movements around the world. For example, like in around 1919, you have this huge upsurge of radical movement. In the 30s, you have the same thing. In obviously in the 60s and 70s, you have the same thing, and each time, the white working class has largely betrayed that. The white working class that is a sector of that is mostly radical is not the majority of that. And unfortunately, it's also true in Chile. Like the way that they divided people also is along colonial lines. I mean, for example, the majority of people in Chile are descended from indigenous people, but a lot of these people also think of themselves as, because they're mestizo, they're closer to white. Or if they can classify themselves as white and pass for that, then they get more social benefits. And so this was definitely used in order to divide, like, the working class and, working class sectors, such as like truckers, from like peasants. And, for example, peasants were largely, indigenous people, and with more of a connection to, indigenous cultures there. Whereas truckers, a lot of them were mestizo, or some drew more of an identification to Western Europe and to Spain, And when you see the United States' infiltration into Chile, they bought off unions. They bought off the truckers' union. They told them to go on strike when Allende was president. They purposely did things to slow down the economy. They paid a lot of business owners to, stop selling products, or to only sell it on the black market. And, again, these are infiltration tactics that you still see today in Venezuela, in Cuba, all over the world. And so it's very like multifaceted, the way that that's imposed in Chile. And again, neoliberalism and this sort of mass privatization of the economy in Chile, protected by the state, that's ideal for the United States. That's the ideal condition. If the state can repress anyone who speaks out against that, and yet still call that democracy, still call that freedom, then that works perfectly for the United States. Because so
yeah, no, most definitely. And I'm glad you mentioned the contradiction between the so-called white working class in the United States and the global South working class, because it wasn't until neoliberalism started impacting the quote-unquote Rust Belt in the United States that the first world US left began even talking about neoliberalism. The Chilean people had already known what neoliberalism was since the 70s, because that shit was implemented on them and experimented on them since then forcefully. The US had no idea. They were reaping the gains of looting by imperialism, and had a share of that profit through neoliberal reforms that extracted wealth from Chile. And it just goes to show that there are contradictions, because a lot of times I think people falsely equate the United States or Europe with every other country in the world. And they'll say, oh, well, there's the working class in Chile, and then there's the working class in the United States. So it's like, hold on, wait a second. The US is the empire that all of that shit is coming from. It is the very source. And there's a very clear contradiction between the oppression of workers and peasants in the global South, like Chile, and the oppression of people in the United States. So I think I'm very glad you mentioned that, because it's also something that even within the left in the United States, we have to make clear that someone like FDR, who was a Keynesian, who seemed like he had all these progressive reforms, all of that was still based on the extraction and oppression of people in the third world. So that's important to point out. And I think that's something that a lot of people in the US left will fail to recognize. And I think another good point that you mentioned is the fact that there's a contradiction between these neoliberals and how they perceive their political and economic ideology and how they carry it out. Because a lot of the free market right-winger types, they say, I'm all about freedom, no government intervention, no one should interfere with my business, no one should interfere and come in and tell me what to do. And even within Latin America, a lot of the right-wingers, they think like this. But in reality, their ideology of capitalism, of the free market, the so-called invisible hand, is the most forceful, is the most authoritarian. I mean, even looking at Pinochet's government, like if you were in any way connected with the left, if you even were reading Marx or Lenin, if you were a student, if you were in a union, you can immediately be kidnapped by the state. There's that meme, that horrible meme that libertarians have of free helicopter rides for communists. I don't know if you've seen that, but they, that's something that under Pinochet that they would frequently do, is that they would kidnap leftists, take them on a helicopter ride, and literally drop them from the helicopter, torture them, kill them. So capitalists and right-wing libertarians are the most authoritarian people ever. And they still think of themselves as being in favor of liberty and individual responsibility. And it's just really disgusting to see that. So what I want to do, Chris, is I want to play a clip from this documentary. I was watching it the other day. I was really disgusted by it. And I was like, oh man, I got to show Chris this documentary, because it basically parrots the same right-wing talking points that Chile is an economic miracle, that it glosses over all of the violence and horrors that took place under Pinochet. So this is from a documentary called The Power of Choice by the Free to Choose Network. Again, part of this libertarian nonsense. And it talks about the imposition of neoliberalism in Chile, the shock doctrine, which you were mentioning. So I want to play this clip and get your reaction, because again, this is the traditional right-wing libertarian interpretation of what happened in Chile with the September 11th coup and the aftermath. So I want to play this and then get your reaction.
With the battle against the draft won and the creation of an all-volunteer force a reality, Milton continues to press home his argument for minimum government and individual freedom. He could not know that years earlier and 8,000 miles away, seeds of the most public clash in his life had already been sown. Between 1955 and 1964, graduate students from Santiago's prestigious Catholic University had received scholarships to study economics at the University of Chicago. Most of the students developed ideas on free markets and freedom similar to those of Milton Friedman and others at the university. They became known as the Chicago Boys. In 1970, with the support of Cuba's Fidel Castro, Chile elects the first communist president in the Western world. Salvador Allende immediately nationalizes basic industries and controls prices and wages. The Chicago Boys remain quietly in the background. One of them is Rolf Luders, who earned his PhD with Milton.
Under Allende, the rate of increase in prices annualized of the month of September 73 was 1,000%.
There are food shortages and strikes. The basis of the economy is copper, and the miners strike dozens of times in just 2 years. The banging of pots and pans is the sound of a revolution in the making. On September 11th, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet leads a military coup against Allende. It is covertly supported by the United States. Pinochet and his generals bomb the presidential palace. Allende is either murdered or commits suicide. the Chilean economy continues to decline. In time, Pinochet begins to listen to the Chicago Boys as they offer their proposal for economic recovery. In the midst of the turmoil, Milton Friedman accepts an invitation from a local foundation to speak in Santiago about economic freedom.
And he said, there's one condition for me to talk to the press, that I can say whatever I want to say. And I said, sure, why don't you do it? And what do you want to say? And he said, well, I want to talk about, the benefits of a free economy and so on. But I also want to say that a free economy has to be accompanied by a free democratic elections and the free government.
Hay que cumplir con la ley.
And I said, well, maybe Pinochet will not like that very much. And he said, well, that's too bad, As I recall, Milton Friedman said opening the economy up to international trade was a key element of any economic reform. Freeing prices was absolutely correct. Getting rid of all these regulations which inhibited entrepreneurships were great. And there was a brief meeting, maybe half an hour or so, or 45 minutes, and that was it. No.
And so Milton Friedman publicly and privately agrees with the Chicago Boys that a relatively short but painful shock treatment is needed to save Chile from the disaster of continued inflation.
So there you have it, a clip from this horrible right-wing documentary, The Power of Choice, by the Free to Choose Network. Just some quick thoughts on it before I pass it over to you, Chris, to get your feedback. One of the things I found was interesting was that they completely glossed over the accomplishments of Allende. They went immediately from his election. They called it a communist takeover, and they went straight into 1973. And it's interesting because the script is very similar. One thing that they failed to mention was that Allende's government was sanctioned and was purposefully blockaded by the U.S. imperialist forces, by the UK, the Bank of England, that were sanctioning Chile, that were purposely trying to overthrow his government and destabilize it in a way that they have been doing with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Cuba, creating economic disaster. And again, these are the so-called free market invisible hand people who believe that there should be zero government interference, yet they use their Western imperialist governments to interfere in the construction of socialism in anti-imperialist countries. Then they blame all of those problems on the policies of socialism of Allende and say, oh, this is why we need to come in and overthrow. So that's like the main thing that I noticed. But I don't know, your reaction to that.
Yeah, I was taking a few notes from that clip. Well, the first thought, like the the characterization of Allende winning as showing Fidel conveniently next to him is that made me laugh a little bit, because because that was the whole narrative, like 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was like no country in Latin America could be doing something without Fidel and the communists supporting them and backing them. And it's like, the reality is you cannot build a socialist revolution without the backing of the people. Like, it's not like folks have state power. It's not like when Allende got elected, he even had like full state power right away, and I mean, that can go into a whole critique of like liberal, engaging to the liberal system to impose socialism. But yeah, that was including Fidel, that was special. But because the thing is, Allende's Unidad Popular coalition only came to power after like years of like this working class and peasant movement building up. I mean, he had run for president several times before, and each time he lost. And in 1964 was the election before he actually won. The United States, the CIA actually poured more money into that election to influence it to the right than was spent entirely in the Johnson versus Goldwater campaign that same year in the United States. So again, this bullshit about the state not interfering. The United States is the state of the world because of its position as empire. It controls, everything in terms of backing capitalism around the world. So yeah, so that was just, and honestly, Allende once joked that on his gravestone he would have written, "Here lies the almost president of Chile," because he had lost, he had run and lost so many times, and but yeah, I thought it was also interesting that they mentioned, like, after the defeat of the draft in the United States, as because of their libertarian values, like, oh, the state can't force you to go to Vietnam, but they still want you. It's like they don't have a problem with exploiting Vietnam. It's like, and like the defeat of the draft, that was spearheaded by the left in the United States, not by
Right.
not by libertarians. So that was also special. And yeah, so but one of the main contradictions that's in that video is like talking about the like the limiting of the state to unleash enterprise, but that's only because of the state's, like, that only develops because of state intervention. I mean, capitalism and all these sort of free market economics never really existed. I mean, as Marx shows, like, any kind of state is a dictatorship of the class in power, and these sort of economic systems were imposed always through state power, whether it be here in the United States. I mean, colonialism is imposed by imperial power. So it's just completely wrong to assume that the state just backs off when it's the state that has to impose this economic system and maintain it by force. That's why you have, even in the rise of neoliberalism in the United States, it's concurrent with the rise of, like, mass incarceration. You have to imprison people in order to make way for capitalism. And in Latin America, and in Chile, you have neoliberalism imposed with the rise of concentration camps and this brutal repression of the majority of the population that does not benefit from this economic system. And so it's just very hypocritical on that front. And I also thought it was interesting that the student from the Chicago Boys that was featured, he is a white Chilean. He went to the Catholic University of Chile, which is, it also speaks to the role of the church in Latin America in maintaining colonialism and, white supremacy and all that. And I also thought it was interesting that they mentioned that, the pots and pans were a sign of a revolution.
Right.
So the whole thing with, like, pots and pans, like, it's a popular form of, like, protest, especially in Chile, where people bang their pots and pans and stuff. But as you see, and as you see again today, when the CIA supports organizations that do reactionary protests against revolutionary governments, they tend to appropriate also the methods of protest. So those people who were protesting, when they show those protests in Chile, that was like the upper middle class of Chile, and so they were complaining that they were hungry because the economy was going bad. But it was the United States. It was Richard Nixon who ordered Kissinger to make the economy scream in Chile. They took very deliberate methods to sanction Chile, to make the economy not function, while at the same time supporting political fronts in Chile that would overthrow the government. So you see, again, the same playbook in Cuba, you see the same playbook in Nicaragua, you see the same playbook in Venezuela, on and on. And not just in Latin America, you see that throughout the world. So
yeah, it's like attacking the left from the left. I always draw the analogy of those movies. You ever seen those, like, sci-fi movies where they clone a good guy, the hero of the movie, and they make, like, an evil twin version of him that walks like him and talks like them.
Wolverine movie.
Exactly. And that's exactly the strategy that they use. They bring out the cacerolazos, the pots and pans that you're talking about, pro-democracy protests, and they brand it as this left-wing heroic opposition to tyranny. And in reality, it's the complete opposite. It's a complete inversion. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think that's part of neoliberalism as well. Like, it's not just economics, but it's part of that political strategy of attacking the left from the quote unquote left. I want to read some comments. Some of the comrades here had some great points. Shout out to everybody who's watching, listening. By the way, AO, Hillary, Howard, Big Teal. Big Teal said Milton Friedman is another he-devil. Hell yeah, Milton Friedman, he is a huge supporter of Zionism, of Israel, of capitalism. He was a big follower and supporter of Ayn Rand, who is this psychopath libertarian who wrote this book called Atlas Shrugged, that she glorified attacks on exploited people. She said that working class people, exploited people, poor people deserve to be punished for being weak. And it's part of this Nietzschean concept of will to power that the Nazis really admired, where the survival of the fittest, the strongest should rule because they can crush the weak, and they hate and have contempt for working class people. So Milton Friedman, 100% is another he-devil. Howard Saldana said Pinochet also helped Thatcher to recolonize Falkland Islands. That's exactly right. He played a big role. He was very reactionary. And interestingly enough, I mean, maybe this is a conversation for another time, but at one point in China during the ultra-left faction, when the CIA began trying to use the ultra-left Maoists or anarchists against the Marxist-Leninist movements, China actually recognized Pinochet and worked with Pinochet. So that was kind of one of the contradictions within the left that I think is very interesting to talk about, right? And how the CIA uses divisions in the left to attack, the left. And then also Comrade Erica said, within empire are forced into American overconsumption habits, even as poor workers, so wage increases will mean more money to consume, which will affect global South workers. That's exactly right. Talking about the contradictions between the so-called working class in the first world and the global South. Del Sendero said, yeah, that heinous criminal Friedman and his gangster associates at the University of Chicago Economics Department. Horrible, horrible, horrible school. And Deculturation had a funny comment. They said the Chicago boys should be considered a gang. That's very true. And that's what I tell people. I'm like, don't worry about the Bloods and the Crips and MS-13. The real gangsters wear suits. They sit in the halls of Congress. They sit in the boardrooms of Wall Street. Those are the real gangsters, and they can overthrow entire governments, as we've seen. So it's really important to reshift the way we think about crime, right? Because some of the biggest acts of crime are committed by these banksters, these banker parasitic elites who contribute nothing. And Howard said Henry Kissinger is the mobster who ruined the Mapuche solidarity. A lot of good comments here. Chris, any other comments before I play one last clip from that documentary?
I just think that one comment about the United States does. I mean, if you think about the U.S. government, it does act like a mafia, organization. And, it extorts people. It literally extorts people and kills you if you don't do what they say. So, all those shows like Sopranos and shit, they don't got shit on the CIA. So.
Right. It's like the real Tony Soprano is like the head of the IMF and the World Bank. That's why I like to call
George Bush.
George Bush is Tony Soprano. And that's what I try to tell people. And that's why I call the International Monetary Fund the International Mafia Fund, because those are the real gangsters who run the world. So I just want to play one last clip. This is after post-coup Chile. This is their attempt to say, look at the economic success of neoliberalism and capitalism in Chile. So I want to play this and get your reaction to it.
You cannot have a free economy without political freedom. And if you have political freedom, you need economic freedom to preserve political freedom.
In December 1976, Milton arrives in Stockholm to accept the Nobel Prize in Economics. The news of his trip to Chile and his conversation with Augusto Pinochet has preceded him.
From the time we have landed in Sweden, we had 24-hour police protection. There was this demonstration of about 5,000 people in front of the Nobel ceremony place. In order to go from the one place to the other, we had to go out of a back door.
You people have such a distorted idea of what went on. Let me tell you some facts. Number one, I was offered 2 honorary degrees by universities in Chile before I went down. I refused to take them because those universities were being supported in part by public funds, and I did not want to appear in any way to provide any support to the political system in Chile. I'm not a representative of Chile. I'm not an advisor to Chile. I have no commitments to the government of Chile.
I now turn to you, Professor Milton Friedman.
The young man induced his father to pass the ticket on to him. And he came to the ceremony with the express purpose of making a disturbance.
I am very sorry for this incident. It could have been worse. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences asks you to step forward and receive from the hand of His Majesty the 1976 Nobel Memorial Prize.
Let me emphasize that the Swedish people were wonderful. There were a very large number of people who came up to us and apologized for what had happened.
Now, some 30 years later, Chile is a far different place. Although the scars of the past are etched in stone at Santiago's Monument to the Disappeared. For the majority of its citizens, modern Chile has been called an economic miracle. In one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America, Chileans are more affluent than at any time in their history. That the more socialistic governments of the early 21st century have reaffirmed the free market reforms of the 1970s and 80s would seem to be a second economic miracle. These shoppers live in a society of single-digit inflation and relatively low unemployment. Chile has one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America. Record housing starts reflect a solid middle class, and the quality of life in suburban neighborhoods like this one rivals that of North America or Europe. Chile is one of the world's major exporters of fruits and vegetables, especially during the Northern Hemisphere's winter months. Today, Chile is the second largest exporter of fresh salmon in the world. And its award-winning wine industry has become an international success.
So there you have it, more nonsense from the libertarian, crazy far right. Milton Friedman, by the way, he looks like a demon. He looked like, just looking at his face, he looks like those people who like drink baby blood and do crazy shit. He looks literally like a goblin, and he's done some really horrible shit, literally killing and murdering thousands of people with his economic policies. Vile, just as Jenny Lynn pointed out. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, by the way. Arturo, Deborah, to Big Teal, to Erica, to everybody who's watching and listening. Your reaction, Chris, to that horrendous clip. But that's the mainstream media line, right? That Chile is an economic miracle.
Yeah, it's funny that they celebrate that in a room full of pompous assholes in tuxedos. In fucking, what was it, Switzerland or some shit?
Yeah. No, Sweden, I think, yeah.
Sweden, all right, same thing. This is disrespectful, I shouldn't say that. But, no, it's so, like, it's funny when he, then when he reflects and says, oh, but the people were so nice. It made me think about, like, how, like, the conception of, like, the people is, like, so different to, like, who you ask depending on their class and racial status. I mean, like even when we go back to the whole thing of like there is not one working class in the United States, much less the world. I think that's just hugely important when you define the people, when you define the community, when you define the country. Like you have to be very specific about who you're actually citing and who you're actually, identifying as that group of people. So yeah, Milton Friedman is full of shit. The whole thing where it's like talking about like, oh, Chile is now like a huge exporter of all these materials. That's exactly what the colonial system like prides its internal economies on. Like it leaves active underdevelopment of the global South. Like it's not just like it leaves it behind. Like it's actively fucking them over. Like it's because it's an export of all these materials, the people there don't actually see any of that. And the profits from all those exports are not seen by the people because the government does not redistribute any of that money. They don't redistribute any of that money because the United States doesn't allow them to do that. Because when they have a government that does something like that, that's when you see a coup. It's just funny, like, and also seeing like the Dunkin' Donuts stores, and also saying that, oh, this is a sign of economic prosperity. So how many Dunkin' Donuts are in cities across the United States, like that have like homeless people like sleeping outside of them? Like it's not like like even when I mentioned like starting school in New York, I mentioned like how depressing it is just because like you see all this supposed wealth and like people are miserable, and like it is, looking, you see all these stores and stuff, but that doesn't reflect wealth of like people. It doesn't reflect their quality of life. It doesn't reflect how long they'll live. It doesn't reflect the quality of healthcare, education, ability to eat, ability to have housing, decent housing, and the ability to have running water, all these things that are key issues in Chile for the majority of the population, that the people in like downtown Santiago, who were able to find a way into the middle class or, upper class or whatever, that they could care less about because the economy works for them. And, again, that sort of dividing the population or working class into different sectors is also, again, what partially reinforces capitalism and reinforces imperialism, because you don't have everyone, interested in the same thing. You don't have everyone around the same, national interest. So you'll have a substantial portion of people in Chile that unfortunately will be willing to sell out the majority of the population. And even though you see these huge protests within the past year, just knowing what's happening from folks on the ground, like not everybody's for the same thing. Some of those people protesting against the government just think that the government is inefficient. But they're still, like, in terms of their mindset, political mindset, they're still fascists, so not all of them are like these principled revolutionary, and a lot of that is because that was, any kind of revolutionary thought was beat back for decades by the CIA, by Pinochet. So, again, that's where it's sort of similar to the situation in the United States. People are kind of trying to piece together this revolutionary ideology after decades of like imperialism, the FBI and the CIA beating that back and beating back the development of any kind of like revolutionary process. So, I think it's important to point that out.
Yeah, most definitely. And even like it's interesting because even in the footage where they're like, Chile is an economic success and a miracle, they show like the Timberland store. I'm like, okay, so now because Chileans rock Timbs, they're like an economic miracle because they have an Adidas store, because they have KFC and Popeyes. Meanwhile, they're bragging about how all of the salmon exports and wine, which are obviously more valuable commodities and natural to the land, are being exported to other countries. So it's a really demonic, diabolical system where our countries in the global South, as part of the unequal exchange value of imperialism, we're getting all of the hand-me-downs, junk food, poison, garbage commodities that people no longer want in the first world. Yet all of our good shit, our organic food, our fresh fish, our wine, our grape, that's all the wealthy, rich people in the global North and the imperial core are able to access that. And that just perfectly epitomizes the contradiction between the first world and the third world, where in the third world nations are forced to take these commodities, and it's basically a wiping out of culture too. Because if you go to Chile, if you go to a lot of the Latin American countries, people are no longer able to access their own food. They're forced to eat poison, junk food, fast food. Their music is being replaced with this generic pop, reggaeton, whatever multinational liberal garbage that is being imposed. And Nueva Canción, like all that stuff is slowly being like eroded. It's just really sad, because that's why I tell people, like, there's so many elements to imperialism, right? There's like the economic base, which is like the economy, the market, all that stuff. But then there's like the spiritual, the culture, the political. And what neoliberalism does is that it creates a globalized open air prison state where you consume poison, you're attacked by police, you're brutalized, and you're conformed into this one-dimensional being that ironically is counter to what the neoliberals claim is individuality and freedom of choice. So it's just a really demonic thing. But it's been really dope speaking with you, Chris. We got to head out. I just want to read one funny comment from Comrade Big Teal. I know this isn't scientific, but look at how handsome Fidel was, and he fought for revolution. We were talking about how Friedman looks like a demon goblin. And I'm not going to lie, like, I was talking about this with my girlfriend, Ophelia, that like, when you live a good, healthy life of truth, of revolutionary activism, I feel like your body literally, like, you look healthier and better. But when you're doing all this evil shit like Friedman, like, just look at his face. Like, he looks like I don't know. It's kind of off topic, but it's funny because me and my girlfriend were just talking about that the other day. We're like, damn, these imperialist mafia types, they're so like demonic and evil looking. But yeah, man, it's been, I definitely would love to have you back on, man. It's been, a real pleasure speaking to you again. We have been talking with Chris Durán, student and community organizer, working with Free 'em All New Jersey. Make sure to support Free 'em All New Jersey. And Chris also works with several other campaigns to free U.S.-held political prisoners and prisoners of war. Chris is a first-year graduate student at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Chris, any way that people could follow the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put my personal platform out there, but
also good.
Yeah, now Free 'em All NJ is on Instagram. We also have an email. It's just freeemallnj@gmail. You know, basically we again try to raise consciousness around the political prisoner struggle. You know, try to get folks, if they're in their own organizations or if they want to form organizations, to do things like write letters to political prisoners, donate to commissaries, hold events, teach-ins, movie screenings, anything that people can, because again, one of the consequences of COINTELPRO and the repression in Latin America is that there are U.S. held political prisoners and prisoners of the imperialist satellite states. So,
most definitely, Chris. Thanks again for joining, and we're gonna go out to El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, some revolutionary protest music from Chile, one of my favorite songs, and images of recent protests in Chile. Peace out, Chris. Peace out, Deborah, Jenny, Arturo, everybody who's watching, listening, and Chris, we look forward to having you back on. Peace out.
Ooh.